Hello and welcome to our webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started here. We've got a lot of content to get through. We want to make sure we get to all of it. Today's webinar is Program Outcome Models in Apricot Software. We're going to do a case study on Plummer Youth Promise. We appreciate your interest in today's topic and thank you for joining us. My name is Jeff Hegwood. I'm an Apricot software consultant at Sidekick Solutions. We're an independent consulting firm and Apricot certified implementation partner. Specifically, we help new and existing users integrate Apricot with the way that they work. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Sarah Morrill. Sarah's the Director of Outcomes and Evaluation at Plummer Youth Promise in Salem, Massachusetts. Sarah's a licensed social worker with 20 years in human service related data analytics, outcomes measurement, and program design. Sarah joined the Plummer team after working as a consultant for Plummer Leadership on the Plummer Intervention and Outcome Model, and that's the focus of today's webinar. We put together this webinar to answer a single question. How do we design a program and outcome model and then set up a data system that enables that model? Now, Sarah and I are both excited for today's webinar because Plummer's recent program growth and adoption of Apricot software is going to highlight their journey towards answering this question. We're going to cover this in three parts: designing a program model, assessing the gaps in Plummer's initial data system design, and then system redesign to integrate with the program model. We're going to cover a mix of strategy and technical components, and we intend to cover quite a bit of ground. Rest assured, following this webinar, you're going to get an email with a recording of today's presentation and a copy of the slides. We're also going to open up the webinar for questions at the end of the presentation, and we do plan to stay beyond the 60-minute mark to answer any questions that you might have. So let's go ahead and dive in. To start, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah. She's going to give us a little background on Plummer and explore the Plummer Intervention and Outcomes Model. Take it away, Sarah.
Thank you, Jeff, and hi everyone, and thanks for joining us. So here are some photos from our location here in Salem, Mass. As you can see, our main office is right here on the water. And being a beautiful day out here, you might hear some seagulls in the background or kids playing on the beach, so just bear with me. So Plummer actually started as a, quote, farm school of reform for boys. And we got our name from the woman, the philanthropist who originally gave the bequest to start the school in 1854. So Caroline Plummer had left the money in order to start a school for boys. She incidentally had lost many brothers to their work as sea captains and wanted a place for boys to grow and thrive. So it was originally envisioned as a juvenile diversion program, but we evolved along with all the changes in child welfare over the years and became an orphanage serving dozens of children at various times. And so by 2005, over 150 years after our founding, we were down to serving 10 teenage boys at a time in a traditional group home setting. So all of our kids were and continue to be referred through child welfare. And so while we were considered to be a successful program at that time, and that kids who lived here, did well while they were here, the leadership, staff, and board felt that we really could be doing a lot more to support youth, especially as we learned more about what happened to them once they left. So like many kids in foster care services, as they got older and sort of age out of the system, they wind up homeless, early pregnancy, drug and alcohol abuse, not finishing school, etc. We really didn't want that outcome to continue to be our story. We really wanted something better. So we began a period of deep reflection, and it culminated with a new vision, mission, theory of change, and our intervention and outcome model. It's really important that those two things stay together. It was purposefully designed as an intervention and outcome model. We'll talk more about that later. So we really wanted to be able to answer these key questions that you see here, and we made a commitment back in 2005 between 2005 and 2010, we really did a lot of work on this and made a commitment to start to build our intervention and outcome model in order to answer these key questions. And it really set us on the path to be able to do so. So today, what's that, like 14 years later, we are serving both girls and boys. We serve all ages from infants to young adults, and we serve them in our residential programs, which have grown, foster care program, and our community-based programs. So our name now reflects our real theory of change and our promise, which is family for everyone. So family is really important to us, and as we moved through the visioning process, we knew we wanted to focus on the permanency piece of work, which is sort of non-traditional for residential programs. We were really more about preparing kids and connecting to them to the community, but we really honed in on the permanency piece. And so we use the best practice definition of permanency, which you see here on the screen. So this really focuses on those enduring family relationships, ideally with legal rights, but we know that sometimes, particularly for much older youth, that may not be the outcome. So we want to be able to measure the relationship status as well as the legal outcome. So what it means is that they have the status of full family membership, their physical, emotional, social, cognitive connection to their culture, their religion, their siblings, and their heritage is maintained. So the definition of family for us does not mean biological family only, and this is a really important distinction of our model. It can be anyone and everyone who provides this kind of a role. So while our journey has been long, this webinar will really focus on our more recent history, specifically the development of our intervention and outcome model and the alignment of technology to measure our clinical practice. So that being said, it's important to understand that the program and outcome model came first, and we had the luxury. We did not have an electronic system at all. Everything was done on paper, lots of index cards, some Excel spreadsheets, but very minimal. So we kind of had the luxury that we were building this intervention and outcome model and thinking about what we wanted in the data system at the same time. We do think, though, that that's an important sort of thing to think about, that a strong model should precede the data system. When you already have an existing data system, thinking about how to adapt that data system to a strong model is another approach that could be used. So we started the design of our program model the way most organizations do. We started with our experience. And based on our experience, again, we knew we were getting clued in more and more that families were the key to permanency for at-risk youth. But we had little data to support the anecdote, and we knew the field had some data, but it wasn't really tested with the population that we served and in our own experience. So we wanted to test our theory of change against the day-to-day practices that were followed by our caseworkers. And when I refer to caseworkers, I mean the internal staff here working directly with youth. So we needed an intentional and purposeful program model. We applied a twofold approach to designing this model. So research is critical. We learned as much as we could about the existing outcomes for the population we serve, and this included looking at information in the child welfare field. And parallel to that, we did this really deep dive internally, looking at all those data sets. Again, mind you, these were like index cards stored in the attic and discharge paperwork. And we went through the previous 3 years so that we could better understand what was happening with the kids we served, and looked at that alongside best practice in the field. So parsing those together, we were able to really come up with a complete view of who we serve, what was happening, and know more about what we wanted to happen. This took a ton of time, and the leadership and the board really decided to dedicate the time and resources to make this happen. And in fact, the volunteer board members, a couple of them stepped up to help do the research. And one of them actually accompanied me as a consultant when I was going out to do the interviews with stakeholders. So that's kind of the next step. We talked to nearly every step. We talked to every staff member, board members, nearly every key stakeholder that we could get a hold of, including representatives from the youth population, the families, our state agencies, and our partner agencies. So we really went out and talked to everybody to learn more about their assumptions about us, what they assumed about the kids we served. So lots of interviews, conversations, outreach. Again, this was really time consuming, but very critical. Once we had both pieces of that information, we brought it back internally to staff. So we wanted to include all staff at all parts of the process. That's really important as well. So here are some of the questions that we asked of all these stakeholders. So we wanted folks to really comment on the assumptions of our program, and for internal staff especially, we wanted to better understand what they thought was possible for those we serve. And so bringing those two things together helped us better understand where our team and culture deviated from best practice, where we aligned with it, and then it helped us identify where we want to go. So all the feedback presented a picture that would ensure alignment of all the groups with our next steps. And the process encouraged, as I said before, participation from all levels at multiple points. And we found that exploring the assumptions and getting to the truth was not always easy, but it was really necessary. And when you're looking at this slide, which I think can be a good resource for folks who are just beginning this work, we spent a lot of time on those two kind of last bullets: which activities, practices, and interventions drive success, and how do we know success when we see it. This takes a lot of very specific, direct questions, but we found it to be hugely important because these are the places where we determined which interventions we thought were going to work, so which activities to measure, and which outcomes, what behavior changes we think lead to success, so which outcomes to measure. So those two are really critical. So following those steps, we created our own template of sort of what would it take to get all the results that we believe all kids deserve. And here's where we landed. We thought that kids need to be prepared to have the skills in order to be successful as an adult. They need to be connected to their community, and they really need to have permanency. And permanency for us meant secure parenting relationship with a lifelong, preferably legal family. So all of these together, we were able to create this visualization of our theory of change. So the global goals of preparedness, community, and permanency became our three overarching outcome areas. Within each of those areas, as you can see, we defined 8 life domains. These domains were those areas that align with the best practice research as well as our internal practices. And these became the essential indicators for how we measure youth progress within each of the outcome areas. These are also where we set our individualized youth goals. So each kid will have a goal in these domain areas. And as you can see from the blue line holding it all together, we really believe permanency is the linchpin. So without safe, secure, stable parenting, it's really difficult to get to that center of a successful adulthood. So the design of our model has evolved a bit as we learn more about the importance of permanency. The original version didn't have the blue line holding it all together. It had all 3 elements, but now we really have strengthened the permanency. So we were working alongside this whole process with a small work group of experts in the field of permanency. So that work was integrated into this model as we grew and evolved. So the current vision for Plummer focuses on permanency practice and is inclusive of our tagline, family for everyone. So we also now have a permanency practice leadership division, and we're providing consulting and training to others in this specific area of practice. So we want to ensure that programs that work with youth in foster homes and group homes really work toward having families that kids can count on forever. So if designing a program model is the start, how do you actually get started? So I would say there are 4 key takeaways from our process. The first being that research and discovery. So start with the question, what do we know about the problem we're trying to solve? And then do that external research while looking internally at what your practices have achieved to date. So our process was marked by extensive field research, and it helped us crystallize concepts and provided grounding in our direction. Another question would be, what does current best practice in the field tell you? So valuing results-based work done by others, we also actively sought to incorporate all those lessons whenever it felt like a good fit. In addition, we conducted that internal discovery process, and we found both the qualitative and quantitative findings were very useful in not only engaging frontline staff into what we were designing, but also better understanding the belief systems around our clients, our programs, and what we actually did. So the final question we really asked was, what do we know about what we already do or what we aren't doing? So the combination of external and internal research creates a body of knowledge, which is the foundation for designing the program and outcomes model. So another takeaway would be, having really strong support. Organizational inertia required to get an initiative like this off the ground cannot be understated. The process of designing a program model really touches upon your organizational identity, its DNA. So there were long-standing ways of going about things and doing business, and it can be really hard to unwind all of that, and even more difficult to redesign it and build it back up while bringing everybody along. And I will say that some people didn't come along with it, but that's okay too, because it's really important that all the people who are working within the organization sort of buy into the vision in order to make it real. So full leadership buy-in and deep stakeholder involvement, both internally and externally, are really required in order to launch this work. So it has to be done in a fully inclusive way that includes frontline staff. They are the ones who are going to implement on the ground every day. So they really should be able to see and hear their voice in this work. And then the ecosystem of tools and supports have to be in place, or at least promised, in order to see the process through. So what you see on the slide is sort of what you want in totality. They don't always come in order, and not all of them. I can't even say that we have all of these fully activated right now, but we're really working toward them. And you see here, trust, time, freedom. These are really important allowances in order to have innovation happen. The one thing that I think is probably missing from here is a good sense of humor, because it takes a really long time and strong communication in order to really implement a new program model. So the next takeaway would be, consider merging evidence-based and performance-based principles. So while our model was informed by evidence-based practices through the research we did, the measurements of our theory of change is really performance-based, because we're testing our own theory of change. And we talk about performance-based, we're talking about the ability to collect and measure program outcomes and the indicators that lead to positive outcomes, or that lead to negative outcomes. So it's all about the learning process. And to demonstrate continuously improving outcomes through positive trends in performance. So being able to make those connections of what seems to work, for whom, and under what conditions, and can we repeat that over time? That's what we're trying to do. As I said, we're measuring our theory of change. So to do this, we developed some homegrown tools and some processes that model what we experience day to day. So we took that best practice, particularly around the permanency practices, and created some tools to measure change over time. So they're not evidence-based, but we do believe that they address our work, and we're eager to test them in the field. So in the here and now, we're really focusing on measuring performance, learning, refining our tools, refining our processes, and then measuring again. So whether our assumptions are right or wrong, we really believe that it's worth testing. And I think approaching measurement in this way really can lead to some innovation. So I think we're being a little bit entrepreneurial in this endeavor with this goal to demonstrate our model. And whether formal evaluation is in your future plans or not, I would say consider this performance-based approach because it's something you can start right away. It also helps solidify an agency culture around your vision. So having a clarified vision and then a process in order to implement and measure that vision really helps coalesce a team in a very unique way. So the fourth takeaway would be to design a universal model and just start to document heavily. So you're going to hear a consistent theme in this webinar about universal. We really designed our model to be universal across all the programs, all the kids we serve, all the services we offer. So while the services may vary a little bit, depend on the age and stage and program that the kid is in, our approach, permanency, preparedness, community, with permanency as the linchpin, is universal. So in day-to-day practice, this means that we streamline our forms as much as possible. So we use the design of the data system to reinforce the model. We have one universal intake and discharge. We have a shared treatment planning form, shared service coordination, and we have our own homegrown outcomes assessment that we call the matrix. It includes a 4-point scale that measures progress along a continuum of our 8 domain areas that you saw earlier. We also reimagined a daily progress note, and it's universal across all programs. So all staff on all shifts, regardless of their level of staff, could be overnight weekend staff, or it could be our highest level clinician, they all use the same form. And in that way, everybody's participating in the kids' goals and outcomes. So we can use form logic and permission sets to allow for the confidentiality that we might need to stay in place, but having everybody have access to the same stuff, that also helps create a culture that we're all in it, we're all about the kids, and we all work together as a team. So the universal model simplified our standard operating procedures, and it focused our team around those core principles, but it didn't decrease the need to document our processes. So we do heavily document all of our procedures, and it's really been key to helping deploy the model across our programs. And I know Jeff is going to talk more about that in a little bit. So with our program model in place, it was time to really start talking about the data system. And after some searching, we selected the Social Solutions Apricot software. And I'll tell you the reasons were primarily because we needed something that was really easy to use. I was going to be building all the forms and reports, and I had no experience in doing any of this. We wanted to get everybody off of paper, so we wanted electronic records, and we needed something that was not going to blow our budget. And Apricot filled all of those needs. And we were finding it really difficult to become more data informed, so we'd made this commitment in our strategic plan back in 2010, I believe, to become more data informed, but didn't have a data system. And all the paper forms and spreadsheets, they just were not cutting it. And so Apricot was, had promised to really manage data for both clinical practice and outcomes. And so looking at both sides of this coin, it was really evident that we wanted Apricot to organize our data and reports on outcomes, but we really wanted the system to reinforce the clinical practice as we were really adopting these new, stronger clinical practices. So we wanted Apricot to really help users kind of stay in their lane and make sure that everybody was implementing the practice and the methodology that we had developed for supporting youth, particularly toward permanency. So these are the principles we held going in, but we didn't have concrete examples on how this translated to Apricot or any data system for that matter. It was all brand new to us. And it was really difficult to see the full picture of what the data system should be. And given that we were transitioning from various forms, spreadsheets, and index cards, it made it even harder. we kind of had a direction for the program, but when it came to the data system, we were really learning as we went. So at the very start, we were able to build forms, and I kind of learned how to do the dynamic links that say thank you to some real support directly from Apricot. And we were able to get some reporting and get basic census, demographic data, trend reporting, that kind of thing. So we moved through sort of the Apricot 101, if you will, and we were leveraging the basics and standards that Apricot offers right out of the box. But as we began to refine our model and continue to grow the organizations, we started adding more programs. We were really stretching the limits of the configuration in Apricot. So we were kind of evolving beyond the 101 basics, and we were really ready to graduate to 201 or higher. So with all those new programs being added, and some of them were focusing on one of the 3 outcome areas, we also had new funders coming to the table, and they wanted different specific data sets. And Apricot began to feel like it just wasn't doing what we needed to do. We were feeling more constrained by it instead of enabling us to do all that we needed it to do. And in the end, it just wasn't configured properly for our growth. So there was kind of a lot of internal friction and a lot more time being spent on cobbling together reports as opposed to just having it produce the reports that we kind of knew it could, if only I had the capacity to build it. So we ended up with this laundry list of challenges, and specifically we were finding it really difficult to track multiple enrollments. So when a youth enrolled in consecutive programs, because we do offer a continuum of care now, it was hard to track a youth going from one program to the next. Or if a youth left and came back, and this happens all the time in child welfare, they would re-enroll after a gap, so it was hard to sort of track those individual enrollments. We were also losing some historical data. So when youth would change status in a program, we weren't necessarily tracking status as of, we were tracking status as of today, but we weren't getting the historic context. We were also unable to correlate data. So across intake to outcome ratings, progress notes, discharge data, all those independent pieces that really patch together the story for us, I was relying really heavily on either external reporting systems or exporting things and doing manual work to make the data meaningful. So it was taking a lot of time in order to get the kind of message that we were looking for. And through all of this, we were making sort of changes to things, and forms were getting larger and larger, and staff were becoming increasingly overwhelmed by all the data entry tasks required. So we tried to uncover the cause for these symptoms on our own, and we developed a priority list of items that we hoped to resolve in Apricot. And we even made attempts to literally draw out the architecture, like on graph paper, to better identify what we were missing. But we really needed a fresh set of eyes, and that's when we contracted with Jeff at Sidekick. And he was able to kind of right off the bat notice the potential gap in our system, and it was around a program enrollment record. And I know he'll talk more about this later, but as we worked through our priority list, the enrollment issue just became bigger and bigger. We kind of couldn't get to where we wanted to go without really tackling this. So thinking about redesigning Apricot to fix the program enrollment issue was always an option, but to be honest, we hesitated many times, and because we really wanted to fully consider what this meant. The potential cost, especially the cost of migrating data that we had already collected in Apricot, was something that gave us serious pause. So we had too much budget and too many unknowns to make a smart decision, and we needed to take a step back, look at the system, and look at it holistically, but with a process that respected our budget constraints. So what Jeff suggested was an Apricot database specification and discovery, or SPEC, as he calls it. So the SPEC project is a way to get some answers and explore some options. So we kind of put a pause on the priority list that we had started, and we followed Jeff's lead to complete the SPEC process. And so Jeff's going to talk more about that.
Thanks, Sarah. So Apricot's a builder. It has a set of rules and constraints on how you can build programs and workflows. but it allows the flexibility to create custom data entry and reporting systems for nearly any program or service. So most Apricot builds are unique. Even when they're similar, there's slight variations that make them custom. So in order to assess Apricot, we really have to lay out all of its pieces on the floor, kind of stand over the top and figure out what's what. And that's what the spec does. There's no way to do that in Apricot itself. The spec is actually a mapping process that we do called an entity relationship diagram, or ERD. And the slide here kind of depicts that transition. You're taking your forms and links and you're putting this into a map. So while the finished ERD looks a bit like a subway map, and honestly, it can be a little overwhelming to look at, I'm sure Sarah can attest to that, the end product gives us a complete look at the forms and the linking relationships between those forms. Doesn't matter how unique or how custom an Apricot database may be, this gives us the full picture. So the big question is, why is this important? Well, forms and links determine how you can report on your data in Apricot. Specifically, what kinds of reporting is possible or not possible, how those reports are configured, and in many cases, how efficient it is to build a report with your data. In totality, forms and links are the whole ballgame. So the spec for Plummer was a 3-part project that took about 30 days to complete. We developed an existing ERD of what they had. That process alone identifies a number of immediate concerns or red flags or areas of opportunity. And we found 4 that stood out. The first was that the system wouldn't scale long term because each program had its own set of forms and its own set of reports. It was not universal. So each program they had to add was being done in a silo. And the reporting that Sarah wanted to do long term just wasn't possible without very heavy lifting. The second piece was that there was no universal program enrollment. Now, they needed a single discharge form by all shared programs. And because we didn't have a single enrollment form, it meant that we were limited in our ability to not only implement new programs, but report by each specific program, especially when youth crossed programs, or, as Sarah mentioned earlier, discharged and then came back. In addition, we weren't able to manage the clinical practice in Apricot. There was no workflow systems to govern the treatment planning process, nor assessments. We were able to track goals, but the system didn't alert users when the next interval was due. This is a big key. Users had to remember what to do next. And that's a very difficult constraint when you're dealing with a data system, because at that point, data quality becomes a concern. If we're missing tasks or doing things in the wrong order or sequence, we can impact our data quality. Finally, we took a list of Plummer's top 30 reports, all the metrics that went into those, and we found that a majority of those reports couldn't be built in Apricot without exporting to Excel first. There was a ton of additional analysis that would need to be done in order to even get the reports in the right format. And when we look at all that in total, it's not ideal. And the big key word is it was inefficient. It was inefficient to produce reports. So the next process we went through is we created a vision ERD. We took their workflow and reporting requirements and built what the system should look like in the end. And then with the 2 ERDs in hand, we concluded the spec by comparing them and noting the differences. So generally speaking, the spec process supports one of 2 directions. Either the differences between the 2 systems highlight a need for redesign and the potential of a transition to a new configuration, or it's going to show us how we can make incremental changes to an existing system that aligns it with the vision. In Plummer's case, we identified a clear need for redesign, and probably not surprisingly, because we've hit it 3 or 4 times already, it's centered around this concept of program enrollment. So the decision to redesign at this point was now in play.
So for us, this first investment for the spec was pretty easy, and that's really the point. We needed a low-cost, low-risk project just to get us started. But the next investment for the actual redesign wasn't quite as easy. We knew that this redesign could be a substantial investment, and remember, price point was one of the driving factors when we chose Apricot, but we didn't really know where that redesign would land. So I cannot make light of the decision to redesign. For us, it was truly like this oh shit moment, because the investment was unexpected, it wasn't budgeted, it was significant, but we knew we needed it in order to have the system really grow with us as we were growing pretty rapidly. So as we saw it, there were two options. Even though we had gaps in our data system, we did notice that staff morale was up. Youth were more engaged in their goals, and staff were more engaged, and really our intervention model, moving kids toward permanency, preparedness, and community, they understood that. So everyone understood our mission and how they related to it. And in addition, all staff were actually using the system at this point. So they were engaged in data entry. They were engaging increasingly so in conversations about data, bringing ideas for how to improve things. So we didn't want to just stop everything. We wanted things to continue to move in that positive direction, but we knew we needed more and different. So it tracked the core of what we wanted, but it was not very efficient and it was not scalable. So if we stayed with the existing platform, we would really have to sacrifice the expansion of our model from a data standpoint in order to administer, manage, and implement the data system. And for me personally, it was a decision of whether I should be managing a database or actually analyzing data and facilitating evaluation, which was sort of more what my job is about. For the organization, it was whether we wanted to staff up around database administration or keep resources focused on programs. So we really had to make that internal decision. So there was a cost to the inefficiencies we faced with the current system, and we had to be really honest about that cost. So while a redesign carried significant costs that was neither expected nor budgeted, it also provided us the opportunity of having a world-class data system, and it would grow with our programs, support staff with the nuance and structure of our outcomes model, and it would efficiently report on the questions that we wanted to answer. So it was a real pivot point for us, and we were about to add another program, so we really needed to make this important decision. And leadership saw the benefit of a one-time expense to redesign the system on the front end here in order to free up time on database administration on the back end. So that would allow us to continue to develop our outcomes management, but not be mired in the administration and reporting of the system. And I think that's really, I want to emphasize that this was leadership really thinking forward about where we were trying to go and the commitment we had made, and considering all of that when they helped to move this forward. So one of the things that we do really well here at Plummer, I think, both in terms of working with our clients and families, but also amongst staff, we work really well as a team. So we did something kind of unexpected, I think, especially when working with a consultant. We decided to share all our project constraints with Jeff. So the budget, the timeline, roles, responsibilities, the whole story. And I'm so glad we did, because that really opened up the conversation to new options that we really hadn't thought of before. And we didn't think it would be possible, but it really did help us move forward.
That sharing, I have to commend Plummer. It did open some doors, and Sarah always comes very prepared to all of our conversations. And we found out that there were two options as part of the redesign. One option was to redesign all programs at once, do the whole thing simultaneously, big data migration, update to the new format. This is going to be a massive project, and it ended up being too expensive. It was just too intense of a timeline to consider, too much budget. And honestly, in my opinion, that type of project is rarely a good fit. These simultaneous all at once projects are just generally more aggressive than prudent. So the second option was to do a staggered implementation. In this case, it allowed Plummer to get closer to their fiscal year break, and that presented a really unique opportunity for us. So the plan was we could implement 2 programs first, then 2 additional programs on a staggered timeline, all before the fiscal year break. That would give us some time, give us some breathing room, and then the kicker. We're not going to migrate anything. No data migration. We're not going to bring any of the historical data forward. Instead, we're just going to start fresh on the new fiscal year with a new system and archive everything in its historical current location. So ultimately, my recommendation was to go with the second option. Stagger the implementation, archive your historical data in place. We had about 7 months before the fiscal year break, plenty of time to get started, get going, and launch these 4 programs. Now, of course, Sarah had questions about the no data migration archive in place strategy, understandably, especially around reporting and user access. Sarah and I were joking. I don't think it was as calmly as I just laid it out, but there was certainly a discussion around how is this actually going to work. Now, with assurances that we could set up the permission sets to allow users to see the view-only historical data, and that there would be some short-term pain of split reporting, meaning you'd have reporting in the old system and reporting in the new. She agreed, and we proceeded with next steps.
So this kind of flexibility really made it possible to move forward within the real-life constraints of our organizational priorities. And it meant that for a period of time, for programs that we already had on Apricot, we would have to pull from 2 data sets, so the new one and the old one, to get a complete picture for all youth. And while not ideal, that short-term pain of split data sets was significantly less than the potential cost of data migration. And so today, over 12 months later, it worked, and it is still working for us. We still have a few kids who straddle the line there, but we know who they are and how to handle it. And so there's really no making light of the decision we made to invest in the redesign. Our internal team, we had multiple meetings, a lot of back and forth, and we had to be honest about what we wanted long-term for the organization. And in the end, prioritizing the data systems and outcome measurement objectives was really important. And Jeff's going to talk about the kind of key takeaways from that process.
So in this phase of thinking about data systems, the first takeaway is you've got to define what's what. So I'm sure Sarah would agree with me on this, but hindsight's a bit 20/20. We probably should have started with the spec instead of diving immediately into Plummer's priority list when we started our work together. Part of this is Sarah's just comes so incredibly prepared that we were ready to hit the ground running. But the takeaway here is that it's best to just step back, get a clear picture of what you're dealing with, because that's how you're going to make informed decisions on next steps. Now, it's understandable to be skeptical of assessments. A lot of assessments sit on the shelf, they're not acted upon, they waste valuable resources. Our approach is a bit simplified, and it makes assessments a little bit more palatable. So, number 1, define the current state. Where are we at right now? Number 2, where do we want to be? What's the opportunity? And then just compare the 2 together. Now, the cool thing is that if the comparison validates the challenges that you have right now with opportunities for resolution, then the assessment did its job. That's what creates your action plan. The big takeaway here is that learning what's what is a low-cost first step. It's going to ground your decision making, and it just lays out all the pieces on the table. The second takeaway is that you really have to look at a complete equation, a complete comparison of value. So all investments are evaluations of value. There's a cost to redesign, And in Plummer's case, there was also a cost to not redesign. There's benefits on both sides of that equation. Building the case here is essential. So generally speaking, and I've got a link here where you can read more about these 4 domains and some concepts on building a business case for software changes or purchasing new software. But generally speaking, when we're building a case for software, either redesign or purchase or any of the factors that go into it, we're looking at costs and benefits in 4 primary domains: efficiency or inefficiency of time, pure dollar costs, either increases in revenue or income opportunities, or just pure dollar outlays, the accuracy of decision making, like having clearer information. And then there's also the increase or decrease in emotional energy, like stress or focus on your team or your leadership. Again, more information at the link here at the bottom. The third takeaway is that data migration isn't the only option. The most common response we receive on data migration is, we want total. Migrate all of it. However, with some exploration, we usually learn that total data migration isn't needed. The best strategy here is to consider a transition on a calendar year or fiscal year break. Then you just cope with the split reporting for a short-term period, maybe 1 or 2 years. It's going to lower the cost of your redesign, and it's also going to shorten the timeline for redesign. When it comes to data migration, we advise most of our clients to be realistic. You got to think about what data means, how you're using it, and then you've got to think about alternatives like archiving your data in place. Often, you'll find, and I think Plummer is finding this, that migrating the data isn't as important 12 or 6 months down the line. And the really cool thing is you get your cake and you get to eat it too. The chance that the migration ever becomes a priority in the future, your data is sitting right there. Go ahead and migrate it. Let the urgency for data migration drive the decision making. You don't need to do it until it really becomes a high priority. So once the decision to re-implement was made and our project kicked off, Sarah was very clear that the system should facilitate the analytics we needed, but equally important was configuring the system to reinforce the clinical practice. This was a unique challenge as well as an opportunity in the Apricot platform. So this, like so many parts of Plummer's journey, it just took time. We met weekly, and although the spec identified the general architecture for our vision Apricot, we continued refining assumptions and clarifying vocabulary. We actually didn't get the design right, kind of quote unquote right, until the 4th iteration. And that was one of the best meetings I think I've ever had. It was really funny. Sarah and I just kind of stood there in silence and we're like, oh, I think that's it. I think we got it.
I think we got it.
Yeah, I think that's the one. So during this process, we identified a handful of design choices that were essential to Plummer's goals. Now, we can't cover Plummer's entire system in this webinar, and certainly not every step that we went through to get to where we are today. But there are some highlights worth noting, and we're going to go through a few of those technical components in Apricot right now. So the first one, and we told you this would come back, was universal design. The key assumption going in, and it became the foundation of everything we were doing, is that we needed to save time on Apricot database administration, reporting, and future program implementation. Now, the way that we design their system, Plummer's core system supports cross-program data tracking and the ability to use one set of reports with program level filters. That's huge. So Plummer, just to do the math, Plummer has 5 or 6 programs. Let's say you built 20 reports total as your core. If you didn't have one set of reports with program filters, you'd have to multiply that 20 number by 5 to 6 programs. That's a significant build. So their new system has a shared referral form for tracking incoming referrals and also program eligibility. We've got a single universal face sheet for tracking core demographics across all programs. We have a shared intake and discharge form, so we can report on the totality of participation at Plummer, not just a single program. And we have a shared treatment plan, progress notes, and outcomes assessment, so all programs can operate from the same intervention and outcome model. Now, the most technical component of this entire universal system was the intake and discharge form, and we called that the program enrollment form. Now, we've touched on this program enrollment form a number of times during this webinar, and here's why it was a challenge in Plummer's initial design. Programs have different criteria for entry and different criteria for exit. Now, in the new design, Sarah and I had to hack through all of those differences and try and find the common threads. And when we did that, we got our core enrollment record. That was a big task. And even doing that, we still found some uniqueness across programs, either from a compliance standpoint or from the standpoint that the program just had some unique characteristics at intake and discharge that we couldn't overlook the uniqueness of these programs. So by keeping the universal system in place, we needed another approach. And to do that, we adopted an enrollment supplement approach. So what we did is we created a second form, and we hard-coded that form straight to the program enrollment so there could only be one and only one ever enrollment supplement. Now, this gave us the best of both worlds, a universal design that honored program specificity while still maintaining a streamlined workflow experience in Apricot. In addition, we could build data quality reports and reporting to show us where enrollment supplements were missing, and we'd never get duplicates in reports because we hard-coded this link as a one-to-one. So the integration of Plummer's workflow in Apricot, aside from the enrollment, was really the breakthrough of the design. And this is where the fourth iteration and Sarah and I standing there dumbfounded, kind of thinking, oh my gosh, I think we just nailed it, really came into being. So each program has slight variations on the intervals they follow to trigger treatment planning events. So you can think of this as every 90 days, check in with client to add a new treatment plan, take an assessment, so on and so forth. Kind of your 30, 60, 90, 180, on and on and on arrangement. But every program had a different interval. Some of them shared, but for the most part, there were differences. So the hardest part of the design was keeping the universal structure while also aligning those different timelines. So what we did is we came up with this workflow diagram here. We used program conditional logic to identify the interval, and we'll show you that in a bit on the treatment plan. And what this ended up doing is it allowed us the opportunity to notify staff what's next. We had always asked since the beginning, can we notify staff on what to do next? And interestingly enough, by getting this workflow modeled in Apricot, we were able to answer that question in the affirmative, and that was the genesis of the active status dashboard. The active status dashboard tracks caseload, just your standard caseload report, but it also tracks progress review and updates to do, treatment plans to do, and matrix assessments to do. So I'm going to go back one slide. Each one of those to-dos is a step in this chain, and this chain is ongoing, and it can go on for an infinite amount of time in treatment planning. So with the active status dashboard, we can inform staff what to do next. And here's just a few screenshots of what this dashboard can do. So first, we have just a simple caseload report with some quick links for easy navigation. How many youth are in each program? The second is the progress review and updates to do. So when are we queuing staff to go in and do their progress review and updates? It's grouped by staff, got additional details like due dates, and quick links again for easy navigation. The third one is treatment plans to do. Now this one's conditional. You must complete the progress review and update on the prior treatment plan before you can start a new one. So these two reports work together. And then the last one shows outcomes assessments to do, or the Plummer matrix. They're sorted in priority order and, like the others, have a quick link to complete the task. So in addition to the active status dashboard, we also built assessment to-do lists and conditional data quality reports, and those systems help us manage and adhere to compliance standards, funding requirements, and then also clinical treatment planning. Another feature of Plummer's Apricot design is correlated data sets. Now, in their intervention and outcome model, we needed the ability to correlate behaviors, services, milestones, domain area ratings, goal status with each interval, each youth, and each program. Now that's a dense list of indicators, and our challenge in the redesign was correlating them across those three core areas, youth, program, and interval. So what we ended up doing is we mapped the interval to the treatment plan. Users would select an interval, and that would correlate all of our sub-data for behaviors, services, milestones, ratings, treatment plan goals, and goal progress. Now, the technical implementation of all of these things, we're going to skip over those today. But the key was that we knew that Apricot, its standard reporting tools, would be able to correlate any single indicator in this set. But we also knew that it could not correlate all of these indicators into a holistic picture. So the goal was design Apricot so that we can correlate all of the data, knowing that Apricot won't be able to generate the perfect report that we need. But because the data is correlated, we'll pull it out into an external reporting tool and we'll get the data sets that we need. And that's a project that Sarah and I have been working on to date, building those external reporting tools to develop this holistic picture of where a youth is at. Now, one feature of this that we, again, don't have time to cover today is the team form. So we noticed right off the bat in our redesign that there were some program-specific forms and some global forms. Global forms meaning that they're related to all programs regardless of how many the youth participates in. The team form was a good example of this. The team form represented relationships that a youth has with other people. We weren't going to link that to an enrollment because we wanted those team members to cross as a permanency indicator across all programs. Now at this point, I have to credit Plummer for their continued investment in Apricot. During implementation, we identified what I would consider nice to have functionality. Now in the nice to have realm, we have things that support treatment planning, data visibility reports, things that surface data so users can take action. Plummer didn't see these suggestions as nice to have. They saw them as need to have. And it really was the core for building an ultimate system of what they wanted their Apricot to be. So there were three primary features that we built in this phase. The first one was the youth summary report, which summarizes a youth's holistic picture. This report became so popular, it's now called a YSR, and it ballooned into 6 parts. Pretty funny, but that report is a slam dunk. And it's every time I publish that report, there's at least 8 or 10 different staff members who have pre-configured filters on it. It's a pretty impressive use case. The next tool that we built were leadership team reports. Now, the concept of a leadership scorecard is not unique, but this batch of reports is evidence of a practice what we preach approach. These leadership team reports look at indicators for active youth, discharged youth, and referrals. Leadership reviews these at all of their team meetings. And this set of reports is set up so they can run them in minutes instead of spending days, weeks, or longer aggregating all of this data together. Lastly, we developed printable templates. So the Plummer team was putting together manual Word documents. They were pulling data from Apricot and typing them into Word documents. So instead of doing those manually, we actually pulled them into Apricot, built a custom template, and now they're printable through Apricot, saving loads of time on configuration of these cheat sheets and compliance tools that they use every day. So Sarah, I know we're a little short on time here, but we're going to keep moving through this content. Again, this will be a recorded webinar. So if you'd like to circle back or you don't have time to finish today, it'll certainly be available for you to do so. But we want to make sure we hit these next topics. So Sarah, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll try to move through these a little quickly. So here we are kind of by the numbers. So these are some of the outputs. So, we went from having 10 kids, we have over 200 now. We had, 12 staff. We have over 50. 42 folks are actively on the system. All our programs that are active on the system are 100% trained and everybody's using it. But I think the most important kind of output here is that our case notes now reflect our clinical interventions and behavioral observations. So we're really able to begin to track what we're doing and what impact it's having. And importantly, folks are really engaged with the vision of the organization and they're using data to support it. I think that example you gave, Jeff, of how many people have filters on some of these reports is awesome, because we went from people having to thumb through case records to find things like, did the kid go to the doctor, to just taking seconds to run the report. And having been a part of the process from the beginning, there's been a huge culture shift. So this slide talks about that culture shift. So instead of reflecting on just the negative behaviors, we're emphasizing the positive. Instead of people being disengaged and rolling their eyes, they're really engaged in the data process. So it hasn't been a straight unencumbered path, but we have found some real positive output from investing in the way that we did and developing the Apricot system. So we feel like we're really well on our way. And some of the positives are, as I've been mentioning, our universal culture. So the data, the structure for data entry and data visualization encourages and reinforces adherence to our intervention and outcome model. That's huge. We're saving time. So we have fewer reports because the configuration allows us to sort of stack reports and filter by program, but we're also moving away from the anecdote to really beginning to look at what is actually happening and why it's happening. And that gives us more time. So we're being able to start to tackle some more of the fun stuff. So we've gone from staff complaining about data to them asking for really specific reports, suggesting new ones and refinements. And I'm beginning now to focus on some evaluation studies that we've been wanting to do for a long period of time. And we're now able to grow our data system with less effort. So as we add new programs, which we've done in the past year again, we can overlay them onto our existing system, and everybody is aligned and moving in the same directions toward that outcome and intervention model. So of course, we still need to improve in a bunch of areas. I think the major areas are around data quality and accountability. So there are two parts to the data quality. So it's not only cleaning data, but it's maintaining regular quality data checks. And as Jeff showed you we already have some of the tools in place that help identify the gaps, but we really aren't as regimented as we'd like to be in reviewing those tools. So we're looking at accountability to those reviews. That's on our radar right now. So adjusting to changes in the vocabulary of data fields and categories is another area. So as everybody out there probably knows, sometimes the state or other funders or other people that you have to report to will change what they call something. I think a really good example of this is how gender is categorized. That's a very fluid concept right now. And so instead of just going in and making those changes, we're taking our time, we're testing it, and we're pacing those changes. So it can be difficult to slow down and intentionally evaluate change, but it's really important to do that. Another area where we need to improve is implementation of new capabilities. So we don't always have the resources, either the time or the attention, to maintain constant attention to Apricot. So I'm pulled in a bunch of different directions, and this can create a really disjointed implementation. So we keep continuing to work on being patient and being patient in our deployment when it feels like we're always sort of sprinting ahead. So again, that notion of having Jeff as a critical team member is really important. So while report development and analytics aren't necessarily a weakness, but it's a constant topic for capacity building. So we're always looking for better ways to report and interpret our data. And we've got some new projects started that we're really excited about that are going to help get us there. So where we're going next is really, there are several key things, but primarily we really want to get at that issue of accountability. So we're trying now to codify some things in policy and procedure, and we'll develop a supervisory tool that's aligned with our intervention model, and that will really help, and that will all be collected in Apricot as well using the staff tier 1 form. So we're excited about that. We're also in the midst of applying for accreditation. So we're going to need to do periodic case studies and assessments, and that's going to be part of the Apricot system as well. We're also hoping to move closer and closer toward some kind of reporting that will itemize the financial benefit of our intervention, the permanency practice in particular. That's going to require some integration with other programs that we use here to collect data. So that's another area that we're hoping to go to very soon. And we want to do those targeted evaluation studies that I mentioned earlier. We've got a couple lined up for this fiscal year that we're excited about. We're also in the process of, we've already joined with 4 other peer organizations who are also implementing the permanency best practices as we do here. And we are doing a shared data study. So that's pretty exciting. So getting the data ready to share out is another part of what we're doing in the next fiscal year. So while the process of designing a model, implementing and then re-implementing Apricot, and now administering and managing both the model and Apricot have been and are time sensitive, we knew that this investment would be difficult, but it would be worth it. And so while we invested a bit more in our data analytics and people systems than we originally planned, we have really found it necessary in order to progress in our work. We have found that the steps we've taken have been worth the investment because we remained committed to that belief in our program, as well as the belief that we need rigorous testing of our assumptions. So here we are kind of back at those original questions. And while we haven't been able to fully answer these questions, we are well on our way. And the journey has been both exciting and rewarding. I think when you're innovating program design, you kind of have to go all in because you're learning all the time, and you need the system that's going to help you learn all the time, that's going to grow with you. And we don't expect our learning to stop. So in turn, our Apricot system is equally dynamic. It's evolving, it's accepting new conditions that we put on it, and exploring the outcomes in the way that we want it to. So the integration between these two and the fluidity of learning and our model, they inherently mean that change is happening all the time. And it produces unknowns and next steps, but our team is getting closer and our culture is more engaged, and we're working together to answer these difficult and interesting questions about our work.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. So that wraps up our webinar for today. I appreciate everyone attending. Sarah and I are just thrilled that you could join us. So shortly, we're going to open up for questions, about a minute here, but I do want to make a quick reminder. There's going to be a recording of today's webinar and the slides. Those will be made available to you later today. So please be on the lookout for an email. If you enjoyed today's presentation, our approach to Apricot, program and outcomes model, let's find a time to connect. Sarah and my doors are open. We'd love to learn more about your organization, program model, or Apricot. So feel free to send us an email. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions. So let me look through the questions panel here and I'll throw one over. Ooh, Sarah, you'll like this one. How do you get staff to engage? Data topics have been a difficult discussion for our team. Recommend anything specific?
Okay. So I think talk to them, include them in the process from the very beginning. And then every time we learn something, we would bring it back to staff and check it and say, does this sound right to you? What's your experience and how's it different? And then also when building the system, reinterpret the forms into language that staff speak. That's the best way I can say that, so that they see and hear themselves and their voice and their role in that. So asking very specifically, what do you do every day, in what order, and why do you do it, really helped, so that when the system was built, people saw themselves. And bring data back. Don't just have data go in, bring it back and say, does this sound like what you're experiencing with this particular youth or this particular piece of the practice?
And the YSR is a good example of that. The youth summary report. It's a day-to-day practice tool, but the way it's designed highlights behavioral progress, and that's why we find so many users customizing their filters, because as a day-to-day practice tool, it's also showing them trends, progress over time. It's charting it out.
Right. And that youth census report, they actually asked for that. So that was really cool to build that.
So here's another question. Can you talk about timeline? How long did it take for you all to get the redesign rolled out?
Ooh,
well,
wow.
Yeah. Do you want to take?
Yeah. No, I think you should. You can start with that.
Well, like I mentioned, we didn't start with redesign. We started with a priority list that Plummer had brought to the table in the current design, and we just kept running into challenges. That was a 6-month process. At the end of that 6 months, we decided that the spec was the next step. That was a 30-day project, so we're 7 months in. And then from there, we had 7 months to the fiscal year break. And that's where we implemented the 4 new programs. Now, beyond that, go live is usually not the end point of a redesign. As I mentioned, Plummer prioritized some what you could consider nice to have features. Those were built over the remaining or another 6-month period after we went live with the data entry system. Now, the cool thing about redesign, you don't have any data to report on right away because it's brand new. So usually you've got about 90 days, sometimes 6 months to build those additional tools. And that additional 6 months is where the YSR, the census report, the data quality tools, the active status dashboard, that's where all of those came from, was that remaining 6-month period. So I think full circle, what is that? About 15, 18 months. But
I'd say
if you
so.
take off the front end, Sarah, it's probably more like a year, a 12-month period.
Well, we also had starts and stops because funding challenges got in the way. So we might have to take a month off here, a month off there. So.
Yep. It's a good question. So I've got another one here. So we use another software. Do you recommend Apricot? Does switching make sense? Broad question, and the answer is always going to be dependent and maybe. So Apricot Facility is a really great platform for this particular function, for programs, outcomes, service tracking, because it can be customized to workflow. So from that angle, we work with Apricot for a reason. We really like the platform. We think it's got a lot to offer and it's got good backing. Transition is a very big question, and I would navigate back to the benefits and costs of redesign that we talked about. Ultimately, the domains that you need to look at are, is switching going to give us basically more or less capability to increase, decrease time, cost, income, stress, energy, better decision making. And I always say, if you're going to move to another platform, it better give you more capability than you have now, because anything neutral or less is a cost. Sarah, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but Apricot's not the only platform you can use. But I do like Apricot and recommend it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really dependent on all those factors, but we have found it to be sort of the platform that works for us. Whether or not it makes sense for somebody to switch to it, you really have to study that carefully. But I highly recommend it for certainly starting up a process like this.
So here's another question. We're in the process of organizing our programs. Who needs to be involved at the beginning?
It's a good question. So definitely executive leadership, all the program directors, clinical directors within the program, I would say staff supervisors, and and the board, if there's any member of the board who can participate, because this really does get to sort of strategically who you are as an organization. I think at some point trying to talk with everyone within the program, touch base with them, makes some sense once you coalesce around sort of what the big idea is, and being inclusive throughout the process is really important.
So again, piecing through these questions here. Oh, this is a good one because we've both had this role. So if we don't have a team with expertise in these areas, can we expect a consultant to fill the gaps? And it seems, we'll add on here, it seems like staff involvement is important. So how much do we rely on outside consultants? Good question.
That's a really good question. I think I think there are kind of two parts to it, right? So if you're talking about program design and sort of outcome design, I think being guided by somebody who has expertise in sort of the design process helps. I do think that a lot of the work can be done internally by staff, but you need a good process in place. So, you know, maybe somebody to help oversee how that process happens. And then from the data side, I think our experience has been, instead of hiring that expertise as a staff person, we are subcontracting with Jeff as sort of a staff member, as it were, to help us with that seemed like a much better investment that was saving us money over time, as opposed to trying to build the expertise internally.
So the next question, this looks like the last question that I've got in the queue here. And if you have a final question and would like to submit that, go ahead and put that in the questions panel. We'll make sure to get to it. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and break here. What do your staff resources look like? And I think you just answered part of this. Oh, Sarah, we laughed about this one because we thought this might come up. How much time do you spend on your model? Reporting, admin, data entry, evaluation. Sarah, what does your role look like on a weekly basis?
So, yeah, I think the important thing about the model is that for us, it is who we are. So really, anybody working with kids or anybody working in and around the data are spending all their time on the model. So, but in terms of, you know, sort of technically how much time am I sort of in the system playing with it, I'm using the data from the system all the time, but having these refined reporting and, you know, much easier ways to access the data really allows me to start to play with sort of more essential questions, which is really fun. So if I had to break down my time, gosh, I don't know. I think it's changed from sort of 100% of my time on Apricot to really using Apricot as a tool to help me advance the work of the organization. So I might be spending, I don't know, what do you think, Jeff? I'm spending, like, you're doing a lot more of the builds and things so that we can get to those questions faster. So
Yeah, I think it's
maybe
it's an
50%
upfront.
of my time.
Yeah, it's an upfront. So there's two sides to the coin. There's maintenance and there's development. So if you're building capacity and developing new tools, your time increase or your cost investment is going to go up. So Plummer's primary work with us was around the redesign and some of those new tools. Now we're in more of a maintenance and capacity building role. On our end, we spend about 10 hours a month on Plummer's system to develop new tools and address real-time challenges or alterations. And for the most part, that's about where we land. Sarah does interface with users more frequently, collecting feedback, making minor changes. But really, I think, Sarah, one of the big takeaways is that with the right system in place, we're not spending as much time on maintenance and admin.
Absolutely.
It's more we're actually building capacity. So like for instance, one of our big projects right now is a project we call aggregate reporting, which is taking all of the indicators, bundling them up into a profile for by interval. So interval 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we have different markers to build a profile for a youth so we can analyze trends, kind of getting part of the way towards predictive modeling, but not all the way, if you will. And that's not the grind of administration. Those are fun projects. That's new. That's increasing the capacity of the organization. That hit it, Sarah?
Yes.
So here's a question for you, Sarah, specifically, and this is a tag on to the timeline for redesign. What percentage of your time was spent on getting this up and running?
That's a really good question. I'd say
maybe a day a week.
80%. Yeah, well, for a period of time, it was sort of 80% of my time.
Yeah.
But once we got things moving, it was you and I a day a week.
Yeah. Yeah, it really depends on the phase. And I think it goes back to, and not to belabor the point, but it really goes back to the equation of value in terms of the software project. And you have to make the decision, what does it look like to not redesign? If the system's not working
Right.
for you, what's the cost of not making the move? And in some cases, that's not high enough to make the switch, but sometimes it is. And once you get past that redesign, if the design is done correctly, your time is significantly decreased. Again, we're not giving you raw numbers, but there's an experience that's felt when that change is made.
Right.
Perfect. Sarah, anything else to add?
Not that I can think of.
Great.
I appreciate the question, so.
Sure thing. So let's go ahead and break here. Again, you'll get a copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar via email later today. Thank you all for joining. Have a good rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.